the last round for having us here tonight. They're not normally open on Tuesday evenings, so they open just for us. Welcome all. My name is Elizabeth Winyars, and I used to work as the science librarian at UMass Dartmouth for 23 years. After retiring in 2018, I went to work as a librarian at the Northeast Maritime Institute in Fairhaven, and I was there for 6 years. And now I have a lot of fun at Thompson Speedway and other racetracks. I travel around the country. I'm a corner marshal for Formula One. I'll be going to Las Vegas in a few weeks. So when you think Formula One, you remember me. The first science cafe that I ever attended was 25 years ago. I was at a Sigma Xi national meeting in the Raleigh-Durham area, and there were a lot of science cafes starting up at that time around that area, and they were also collaborating with NPR. NPR was providing grants for science cafes to start up, so they would have some little door prizes and things like that. And I came home with a cap that says, "A scientist walks into a bar." So I remember that first one very, very well. Let's see. Since then, I've been a firm supporter of Sigma Xi and a member of the UMass Dartmouth chapter. So if any of you are interested in Sigma Xi, UMass Dartmouth has a chapter. All right, our program this evening. Ensuring healthy oysters, best growing practices, and the reality of regulatory restraints. Our guest speakers this evening are Dale Leavitt, an aquaculturist and educator, co-owner of West Island Oysters off Fairhaven, where oysters are farmed year-round. In a good year, his farm might harvest up to 1 million oysters. Wow. Yeah. Our second speaker is Chrissy Petitpas, Assistant Director at the Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries and leader of the Shellfish Sanitation and Management Program. At times, Chrissy must intervene in Dale's business. It's her job to notify oyster farmers of state-imposed emergency closures, whether due to algal blooms or pollution from sewer or oil spills. An article in the New Bedford Light on January 22nd of this year describes the problem of forced closures after release of untreated sewage. So let's hear how Dale and Chrissy work together to protect oysters, farmers, and consumers.
Hey, hi, and thank you. I'm very glad to be here having this talk with Dale. I guess a little more background about me before I hand it over to Dale is I'm a lifelong New Bedford resident. I was born, educated in New Bedford, and I've always had a passion for all things marine science. I mean, if you live in the area, you know, the maritime culture that's so rich in our community is something that doesn't escape any of us. And so as a child, I went to Sea Lab. You know, I went through the whole Sea Lab program, and that program nurtured my passion for all things marine science. And yes, support your Sea Lab program. I went to UMass Dartmouth. I stayed local. I got my undergraduate degree in biology. I minored in biochemistry, and then I went and got my PhD at the UMass Dartmouth School for Marine Science and Technology at the south end of New Bedford. I've been working for the Division of Marine Fisheries for about 16 years now. I started out working in the Habitat program. That program basically reviews all permit applications for potential impacts to marine fisheries resources. You know, if somebody wants to dredge a navigation channel, well, we want to make sure that's not going to happen when winter flounder are spawning, and then we're going to ruin the eggs that just get, you know, laid in that habitat. So I've been working with the Shellfish program since 2016. And so the Shellfish Sanitation and Management Program oversees all bivalve shellfish. And that program is largely managed according to the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, but I'll get more into that later. And I'm going to hand it over to Dale.
Thanks, Chrissy. So, as the introducer said, Liz said, I am an oyster farmer. I grew up in Scarborough, Maine as a commercial clam digger, and went off to college at the University of Maine at Orono and got my PhD up there. Actually, my PhD is in animal nutrition. So if anybody wants to know what to feed their cows, you're welcome to come talk to me. Otherwise, we're going to talk about oysters. So I spent a little over 20 years down at the Oceanographic Institution in Woods Hole as a researcher. Spent most of my time working on PCB contamination in the Bedford Harbor, mostly directed at clams and oysters. About 20 years ago, I jumped from the Oceanographic Institution over to Roger Williams University. I was invited down to Rhode Island to set up an aquaculture extension program like I had been running through the Sea Grant program at Woods Hole. And so I spent 16 years at Roger Williams and retired in 2020 as an emeritus professor. And as I was contemplating retirement, I had a couple of friends of mine come up and said, hey, let's start an oyster farm. I'll never forgive them. So in 2019, we started applying for a site in Petitpas. And in April of 2021, we were awarded 50 acres of bottom in Petitpas, just off Ram Island. And then shortly thereafter, the old Taylor Seafood Farm in Fairhaven came up for sale. And so my two partners and I purchased that farm as well. So we have we had a 50-acre farm in Petitpas. We've since reduced that down to 5 acres for a variety of reasons. And then we have a 47-acre farm in Fairhaven. So the farm, just to tell you a little bit about the farm before I hand this back over to Chrissy to talk about the regulatory environment. It's, as I said, 47 acres. It's just to the northwest of the northern tip of West Island. Many of you, if you do any boating in Nasketucket Bay, you've seen our gear out there because all of our oysters are grown in floating cages sitting at the surface of the water. So each one of those cages will hold 9 plastic mesh bags of oysters, and each one of those bags can hold somewhere between 200 to 250 market-sized oysters. So we buy our oysters at 2 millimeters in size from commercial hatchery. There's one in Massachusetts on Cape Cod that we frequent, and also one in Duxbury. And we will rear them through the first summer as a nursery system, and then they get moved out onto the farm in the fall at about a little under an inch, 3/4 of an inch to an inch in size, and they will sit in our floating gear out there for the next year to year and a half before they get up to market size. I have to check my notes to make sure I'm getting all the high points. So right now we have the capacity on our farm for 22 lines of floating cages. Each one of those lines is constituted as 4 segments, and each one of those segments has 10 cages on it, and there's 1,200-pound lock anchors between each 10 cage segment. So we've got 40 cages on the line, and we currently have laid out 22 lines. So we have about 880 cages out there, and the plan is, as we start making money, hopefully one of these days, we will be expanding on that, so that we're hoping to be able to hold somewhere around 10 million oysters on that farm at any one given point in time. I think that covers. The only other thing I wanted to talk about is if anybody is interested in getting some West Island oysters, we have a oyster vending machine on our farm on Gulot Memorial Drive. And as soon as I figured out how to program the credit card reader, which is a real pain, We'll have oysters available. You can go in, scan your card, open up a door, and pull out a dozen oysters. So we will be setting that up very shortly for weekends only, up until the holidays, sort of a soft opening for our vending machine business. And then next spring, we'll open the night for serious sales. So if anybody's interested in that, I have some cards here, and you can contact me to find out when the machine's going to be open. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Chrissy, and we're going to talk a little bit about her responsibilities overseeing my operation and all of the other farms.
Thank you, Dale. Actually, about your vending machine, the funny thing is, we thought the HACCP issues would be your biggest challenge, not the credit card part of it. HACCP being hazard analysis, critical control point, and so for food safety, anybody who's in the restaurant business is aware of that, and there are lots of regulations post-harvest, and that's where our partner, Shellfish Control Agency, the Department of Public Health, comes in. The Division of Marine Fisheries is responsible for things on the harvester end, so aquaculture, wild harvesters of all bivalve shellfish. And the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, which is this cooperative program that is made up of all of the member states. There are producing states that have a coast that have the product harvested from their waters. There are inland states that are members. There's industry, and then we have our federal partners. So the FDA and NOAA, the CDC, all are part of this national program. The FDA is the major part. So this program is instituted through the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference, and all of these member states and industry and the FDA and other federal agencies get together at this conference, and we review proposals, and any members can submit a proposal. It's kind of like a Congress for all of the standards for sanitation for bivalve shellfish that are going to enter interstate commerce. And so producing communities agree to abide by the standards set by this entity, the ISSC, and the FDA oversees it. So we have part of the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, or NSSP, is a document that has these standards, and the model ordinance part of this document is where there are mandatory compliance. So the model ordinance is, if we are not compliant with those aspects and the FDA comes and evaluates us and sees it, our firms can get pulled off the interstate shellfish sanitation list, the interstate for selling shellfish across state boundaries. And, so adhering to these standards has, there's a high risk to not adhering to these standards, right? And so a lot of these standards for sanitation start with the growing waters. Before anything can be harvested or a farm can be proposed in waters, my team has to classify the waters, and what they have to do is they have to do what we call a sanitary survey, which includes a very comprehensive analysis of all the potential pollution sources in the area. They will walk the shoreline, or if the shoreline's difficult to walk and it's very marshy, maybe they'll boat the shoreline. Before I became the leader of that program, I was a classification biologist, walking shoreline, getting stuck in the mud and marsh, and I remember one time JC, the Nantucket Shellfish Constable, dropped me off, and I got stuck in the mud, and I went bushwhacked through the Phragmites to get back up to the street, and I got in the car with him. He said, nobody's going to want to sit next to you on the ferry. But this is what our team does, right? We have to go out, we identify all the pollution sources, we sample, we test those pollution sources. So the NSSP has standards, so there are certain fecal numbers that are okay. If we exceed certain numbers, then that classification of that growing area cannot be approved for direct marketing. There are different classifications, maybe require the shellfish to be depurated. We also have to sample. So year-round, if the growing area is open year-round, we have to have some data year-round. And so they're going out in all months of the year to make sure each area has at least 5 samples. Some of the things we're looking at are, we mentioned the CSOs. That's a big problem for Dale. I think we have them closed more often than open, unfortunately.
That was about 50.
50. But there are also natural contaminants. We talked about harmful algal blooms, or Liz mentioned it. That's what I did my dissertation research on, harmful algal blooms and the organism that causes paralytic shellfish poisoning. So there's a lot of monitoring, there's a lot of effort in the field and also the laboratory. There are strict standards for even the laboratory. We have to be, any laboratory that can conduct analyses on water or shellfish needs to be NSSP approved laboratory. What that means is they're adhering to the checklist, and the FDA has come in and evaluated them to make sure that they're adhering to the checklist. They've done a method verification on the method, and so there are a lot of hoops to jump through to make sure that we're compliant with the NSSP. A major impediment to shellfish harvest and the aquaculture community are these human wastewater flows through both the CSOs. There are concerns about mooring areas, whether boaters are going to be discharging from their boats, so that we have the Clean Vessel Act, which offers funds to help boats get pumped out so that they're pumping out and getting rid of their waste in an appropriate way. And so basically, where the public health elements of the growing area, and making sure that the sanitation of the growing area allows for shellfish harvested from that growing area to be safe. Another thing is when shellfish are harvested, we have some post-harvest rules because oysters are consumed raw. And there are other natural contaminants with this Vibrio that we worry about in oysters. So we have another whole Vibrio control plan that we impose and burden the growers with, because with climate change and the increasing temperatures, we're seeing the warming waters make these natural bacteria that are in the water grow faster. So there's more of them, and there's a higher chance of getting ill. So we have a lot of strict icing protocols after harvest. So. Just a lot of oversight, especially the oyster industry, because they are consumed raw. So there is a very burdensome regulatory framework for raw oysters. And I mentioned shutting Dale down a lot, but that should also give you a lot of confidence in what's in the market, right? Because when we see something wrong, we're not going to let them harvest. So that means when it is on the market, you should have a lot of confidence in the wholesomeness of that product.
Thanks, Chrissy. So, and we're actually friends. So just to give you a little bit more background on the biology of oysters, they're filter feeders. And that is the root of the problem, because they have a filtering capacity in their gills that will allow them to remove particles out of the water down to a size about 1 to 2 microns. That's 1 to 2 1,000th of a millimeter. And so they have an ability to actually filter bacteria as well as their normal food source, which is the single-cell plants or phytoplankton. And they can concentrate those in their internal cavity where they're holding this. It's called the paleofluid, the fluid inside of their shells. And so under some circumstances, like Chrissy just mentioned, Vibrio, they'll filter Vibrio. There's not enough Vibrio in a unit of water to actually make people sick. But what happens is if that oyster is then not handled properly and it's not kept cold, that Vibrio bacteria will proliferate inside of that oyster, so that in a matter of hours, it can go from a non-problem to a very significant problem where people will get sick. And the last thing in the world I want to do is make people sick, because guess who's not going to buy my oysters if I do that? So it is critical for my business that people are healthy. And so as much as these requirements and these restrictions seem onerous, they're for our own benefit. Without any question, we need to support them and try to improve our science, which is something that we can talk about. But for sure, it is absolutely required that we have these restrictions on our handling and our harvesting of oysters.
One of the biggest problems with these CSO flows, or the combined sewer overflows, where these large old cities like New Bedford, it's really not their fault. But we have these flows where stormwater and the sewage are in combined systems, and when we get these rain events, these outfalls, the CSO outfalls, are meant as a sort of a release valve so that the plant doesn't get overwhelmed, and so that, sorry, I know people are eating, but it doesn't back up into people's homes. But you know, a lot of people don't realize that we're still putting raw sewage into our waterways, but we are. And there's been, over the last few years, the change. This isn't something new. This has been happening all along. What's changed, and the reason why we're now shutting people down, is the state adopted some new regulations that had mandatory reporting, and they had to come up with volumes. So now, for the first time, not only do we know these CSOs exist, because we had little prohibited areas. So prohibited is a classification where you cannot harvest from that area, not even for depuration. All you can do is maybe grow small seed to a very, very small size, and then remove those seeds and transplant them into clean water. So we had these little prohibited areas around these CSOs, thinking, okay, we've got a small closure, that's fine. But once we started getting volumes, and they require reporting within 2 hours, and now we're finding volumes are getting discharged that we really had no idea about. And there's a fecal standard, as I mentioned. The NSSP has a fecal standard for what's tolerated for harvest. And so we sampled those CSOs to find out what the fecal concentration is. And we now have to come up with enough receiving water to dilute it to the standard for safe harvest. And, you know, in some areas it's easier than others, right? If the pipe is all the way up a river, and it's, you know, a river's going in one direction, it's narrow, we just have to, you know, how much water down the river do we have to close? But in a more open system, like here in Buzzards Bay, where the tide's going east, you know, up towards the canal in Buzzards Bay sometimes, and then it's in, you know, going west during the ebb, it's not always clear where it's flowing. The wind is going to impact it, the tide's going to impact it, and the timing of it. So some of these CSOs, really the worst offender for Dale is way up north of the dike. And there's going to be a time to travel, and we really don't have a good grasp on that. And so it'd be, you know, it's something people have a hard time grasping. Well, then go test it and find out. But it's like, when? Is this surge from the flow could be today, it could be tomorrow, it could be on the third day. And we can't be sitting there sampling constantly. So another instrument that we're looking into potentially purchasing is a sampler that's just can be moored, and so that a human being doesn't have to be there dunking a bottle. We can set it to take a sample once every hour, so we can start to get an understanding of when we're seeing these pollution flows enter certain growing areas, or maybe in, you know, even on the site. If we can validate some instruments like this tryptophan-like fluorescence sensor, if we have confidence that if there is sewage present, we're going to get a signal, then we don't have to work on best professional judgment, because it's really hard to use best professional judgment to close Dale down, right? Like, they were closed like 200 days last year. And if Dale, so if we had a we're able to show you slides right now, Dale would have a calendar up that makes me sick, and it must make him terribly sick, because every single major holiday last year, every single one, he was closed. And the holidays are some of the biggest markets for these businesses. So I think encouraging the technology that can help us to be more surgical with our closures and have confidence, because at the end of the day, we are going to err on the side of public health. That's our major mandate. Yes, support industry, but it's not supporting industry, as Dale said. If we have illnesses, it's going to be an issue. We find even when the harmful algal blooms, where if we have a red tide, it might not be affecting the whole state, but the entire market gets impacted when there's a headline that says, oh, this area on the Cape was closed due to paralytic shellfish poisoning. Just that headline, it has the effect of reducing public confidence in the product, and the entire industry gets impacted. So we're really doing our best to try to embrace these tools, test the tools. So the tryptophan-like fluorescence sensor that Dale talked about, and again, plug for Woods Hole Sea Grant. They had some extra money. They rented it for us so that we can test it. And we deployed it right at the SMAS dock, and we knew that the CSOs were flowing, but we weren't getting much of a signal. So we're like, well, we can't waste this, we're renting this instrument. So we went to the New Bedford wastewater treatment plant and said, can we have a sample, please? And we did a serial dilution, and, we with raw sewage, and then diluted it to see just how sensitive it was. And right now this instrument is not sensitive enough. So 14 fecal coliform units per, colony forming units per 100 mils of water is the standard for safe human consumption. So that's the order of magnitude we're looking at that we need to know, be able to sense. And it really wasn't giving us a signal until about 1,000. So that's not a tool we can use. So Woods Hole Sea Grant communicated that. We think the company feels they've refined it to be a little more sensitive. So if they have more money, we'll do this again. We'll do it as many times as we have to try to get the tools that we need to do this correctly.
Yep. So the question is there any opportunities to get funding because of some of the services that Oysters generate for the estuaries? And that was actually, when I first proposed to do a science cafe, my preference was to talk about oysters as ecological engineers. So maybe someday I can come back and actually do that. But just to be aware that oysters do a lot of beneficial activities in an estuary. They filter the water, so they add clarity to the water so that eelgrass can grow. They remove phytoplankton out of the water, which is a direct result of excess nitrogen coming into the water from land-based sources. And so that's oysters' food, and they actually will generate, remove nitrogen. And just because I anticipated this question, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration just recently published an on-site or online nitrogen calculator for oyster farms. And so I can plug in all of the parameters of my farm, and it will tell me in a year how much nitrogen I'm removing from Nasketucket Bay. And based on that NOAA model for last year, we removed 130 pounds of nitrogen out of the water. That's equivalent to 27 50-pound bags of fertilizer that could have been dumped in the water. So that's one example of where oysters are beneficial to our environment.
Go ahead, pick somebody.
Okay, is that?
Hi.
Hi, Dale, thank you both for this. Dale, I know you had a group of about 30 growers, scientists, and policymakers. What's it going to take, and how can it be helped so that you're not closed 200 days a year?
So the question was, what's it going to take between scientists, legislators, policymakers to make it so that he's not closed 200 days of the year? And that question was for you, so I'm handing it off.
No. You can start with it.
Well, we need to stop putting poop in the water. I think that's number one. And it's I understand it's a very, very expensive problem to fix, but that's the start. We need to start investing in these, this old infrastructure that can't handle our waste streams, and come up with technologies and fund those technologies that can handle waste streams so that we're not discharging into our waterways. That's the first one. The other is helping, what we just were talking about, is the instruments that can help us refine where they're going, understanding where they're going, but that's not going to help Dale if we find, yes, in fact, it is impacting your farm. So at the end of the day, we need to abate the flows, and that's really where we need to go with this. I don't know.
Yeah. On a more specific level, one of the bottlenecks that we have right now is getting our samples analyzed. Division of Marine Fisheries has to go through a very extensive certification process with FDA in order to be able to generate acceptable data in the eyes of FDA. And so right now we have one certified lab, which is up in Gloucester. We have a second lab that is in the final stages of certification at SMAS. But we need bodies. We need people that can operate those laboratories and are following these certifiable techniques. And so one of the things that we're starting to work towards, and Division of Marine Fisheries is actually going to be generating a budget for us to work with, to try to start advocating for getting more help in their lab, to get their labs more efficient and effective at running our samples, and to just make the turnaround time for sampling much more efficient for us. So that's a biggie for us. Beyond that, as Chrissy says, fixing the CSOs obviously is the ultimate solution. Last I heard, it was somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6 billion dollars to repair the final 23 or 24 CSOs. There used to be over 60 of them in New Bedford, and they have been slowly cleaning them up, but we still have a ways to go. And so one of the things that we're working on, and then I would, if anybody's interested in doing a little bit of advocacy, there has been a number of legislative pieces that have been proposed in Massachusetts legislature to deal with CSOs. The one that we are backing and trying to find support for is H1000. Can't remember what the Senate equivalent of the bill was. But what they're doing was proposed by Mark Montigny, Senator Montigny, and Representative Markey and Representative Sylvia from the South Coast region here, Dartmouth, Bristol County, is to actually put together a group that would identify funding sources to try to get this done. It's a great first step, and one that we've been starting to get much more politically active about. I've spent my life trying to avoid politics, but it's just not going to work anymore. So here I am. I'm advocating for support for some legislation within the state government that will help us move forward for trying to rectify some of these CSO issues.
So your question was, with the outer harbor closing and these discharges, and DMF has made the decision to look closer into the Slocum River and to see whether we can upgrade that and maybe open it up to harvest and potentially aquaculture, and how do we reconcile those two things in such proximity? Is that pretty much your question? Yeah, so for the Slocums, the community came to us. So typically, areas that were classified as prohibited because historically they had poor water quality, there was a reason for that poor water quality. And because, we don't have an unlimited amount of resources and staff, we are just trying mostly to maintain the open status of the waters that are open. But if the community says, okay, we know that we made all of these houses upgrade their septic systems, we think this was the pollution source, and we believe we've done something to mitigate the problem, can you come take a look again? So it really starts from either the municipality or potentially industry having an interest. When it comes to farmers, we didn't really get into this regulatory aspect, but Massachusetts is unique in the nation when it comes to shellfish aquaculture because we have home rule. So while DMF oversees it on a high level, the municipality licenses the site. Municipalities can have their own rules. Most of the municipalities in this state require you to be a resident of the town. Luckily, Dale does not have that issue where he is.
Grandfather.
He got grandfathered in. So there's a lot of local control. And so it really is driven locally, whether we're being petitioned to go check out an area that's historically been closed. The question is, do I think the oysters in the Acushnet River near Market Basket will ever be harvestable? No, because we're talking about a site that is a Superfund site that has PCBs. And I know, it's terrible. There are oysters growing right in the pipe.
Do they develop some kind of immunity, some kind of response to the PCPs? Or?
Well, could you take them out and move them somewhere else?
Yeah, we generally,
I guarantee you there's people who go down there and eat.
there may very well be, yes. I mean, they're not supposed to.
3 languages that says don't eat.
Yes, it does. That's
So I spent almost 20 years looking at bivalves in New Bedford Harbor with respect to PCB contamination. So the thing about PCBs are they're a lipophilic contaminant, which means that when a bivalve is exposed to it, an oyster or clam, it gets immediately sequestered into the fat content of their body tissue. And it's very, very hard to remove that from that chemical matrix that it's in. So as long as there is PCBs in the substrate, which there is, and it's going to be, I mean, they've cleaned up a lot of it with these CAD cells, but they still have a long ways to go in terms of making it clean enough so that you can actually eat shellfish under the inner harbor. Whether it will ever happen, not in my lifetime. Not that that's going to be that much longer. So the question is, can we put them in like an alternative site?
Well, if you start growing 1 million, can you grow up? I don't know how hard it's how easy it is to grow oysters, but up 1 million you grow in a good year. You sell 800,000, keep 200,000 in reserve, and what they're going to do is to keep the water around you clean so you can stay open more regularly.
It's a very interesting concept. We don't have enough data to be able to make that kind of a determination. One of the ways that we get around the closures is that we have that second farm in Petitpas is in an area that is not as aggressively closed under emergency closures. And so what we do is we keep enough oysters growing out on that second site so that should our main farm, which is BB21, that's a classification area, should that main farm be closed, we still have access to product that we could put on the market through BB20. And so that's how we're dealing with it now. This is a fairly new development. We just started it at the beginning of this year, but it seems to be working out fine because we're closed right now. We'll be closed probably until next Monday, Sunday and Monday. But we are marketing oysters because we had some out at our alternative site. So the question is, the location of our farm seems to be fairly isolated from where the outfall from the wastewater treatment plant is and where the CSOs are discharging. And so how do we know that that's actually getting contaminated? At this point, as Chrissy said, it's based on professional judgment because we just don't have enough data to be able to ascertain whether they are or are not harboring any kind of human health risk. But that data is rapidly being collected now by Chrissy and her crew at DMF.
and to follow up, so we did not model the CSO discharges, but another wastewater flow that is of major concern that we have to regulate around are the treated sewage discharges out the pipe for the wastewater treatment plant. The wastewater treatment plant effluent outfall. We did have a Dr. Chen from SMAS modeled those flows. And so we do know that flows that come out of New Bedford, so Fairhaven's own wastewater treatment plant, which discharges just north of the dike, even impacts the area. So the modeling suggests that it goes into the area. You can also see it. So the causeway onto West Island, it has a culvert, and you can go, any of you can go on Google Earth right now, look at that culvert, and you're going to see the sediment wash from the rush of the incoming tide from that area. So we know that it does get in there, but the timing of it does, you know, if the discharge is during the ebb tide, then it's going to be ebbing out of Buzzards Bay, right? Not, it floods into Nasketucket Bay. But there's a lot of uncertainty in how long it takes to even get down south of the dike. The vast majority of the discharges into New Bedford Inner Harbor is up and near Coffin Avenue. That's CSO 23 is the big discharger. And I mentioned how we know the volumes and we've tested the concentration. So now it's just a matter of, well, how much water do we have to close to say we diluted it? And some of these rain events, we're talking about tens of millions of gallons of discharge. And so when we're talking about tens of millions of gallons of discharge and a relatively high concentration of fecal matter that needs to be diluted to that 14 standard, we have to come up with the water. So that's the hard part, to say, okay, we need to find water that's diluting it, but we're not exactly sure where it's going at any given time. So that's where the best professional judgment goes. We have tested the water and we've seen some signals of the flow. As a matter of fact, that time we didn't close yet, I went out and tested them, but we got the signal.
But that's the cause of it.
So it's a difficult thing to answer, because at the end we have to err on the side of public health, and right now the only tools we have is pathogens, viral and bacteria, and when it comes to wastewater flows, they're also worried about any number of other things that could be in it. So you know, we're really focusing on CSOs right now, but the New Bedford wastewater outfall is a major discharger that, because of the requirement for dilution, and that's around 26 million average per day, they have a certain 320 to 1 requirement of dilution, and so the EPA may be coming to do a dye study, and we're going to find out, you know, based on that dye study where that is. And it's not just for fecal material, it's for any of the poisonous or deleterious substances that could be in that waste stream. And that's also been a major point of contention, because people are like, test it, show me that my product isn't safe. But when it comes to the wastewater flows, any number of things could be in that, and there's no way we can test for everything all the time. And so that's part of the problem, is that there are so many things, and it's an open system. Anybody can introduce anything into that waste flow. So there is expected to be a certain level of dilution out of what comes out of the plant, even when it's fully treated. And then when it comes to these CSO discharges, you know, if we're not sure, the FDA would say, well, close in both directions. If you don't know which direction the flow went, close in both directions. And it's a really hard pill to swallow, that we're doing this now in recent years and these flows aren't new and people haven't gotten sick. So it's.
So did something change to cause the closures versus, say, 5 years ago?
Yeah, now we know the volumes. We know that at a certain event, 30 million gallons might go out, or 20 million gallons. And so now the NSSP requires us to dilute that volume. We didn't know volumes before. Okay, so the question was whether we could trace back contaminants to their sources. That's very difficult and expensive to do. And it depends on the contaminant. So some of the biological microbial contaminants, sometimes we can find out, did it come from dogs? Did it come from human waste? Did it come from waterfowl? But it is very expensive to do. And then depending on what you find, you could say, okay, well, we know this is the source, so either mitigate the septic systems or tell people if they walk their dogs on the beach, they have to pick up after the dog, or, you know, whatever it is. The waterfowl, we didn't even mention the waterfowl. With aquaculturists who use floating gear, a major issue in the state is deterring the waterfowl who are roosting on the floating gear, you know, exactly. So that's something that the FDA, when they come to evaluate us this past year, they cited us for having some farms that don't have effective enough deterrents. And so in those cases, you know, we may shut down the farm, we may make them submerge their gear so that the oysters are deeper and, you know, maybe for 10 days so they can continue to pump just in case they have some kind of a load.
I will say just one more thing, and that is, Chrissy and I are friends and we work together, but we still have our disagreements. and water distribution is one of them. So up in the back.
So I believe the question was, as someone who's lived by the water and eaten oysters for 40 years before we started closing down the areas, were you asking where can you get them tested?
Yes.
If your area is not subject to constant closures, you know, I wouldn't worry about that. So, I mean, unless you're, you know, have you been harvesting oysters out of New Bedford Harbor? So we can test oysters for, what we use is, it's called male-specific colophage. It's a proxy or for viral loads. And that is the only tool we have actually to get these farmers or even the wild harvesters open after a CSO discharge or any raw sewage discharge. Sometimes we have to close an area, granted very small, because a kid dumped a porta potty off a dock, right? It's still raw sewage, and we have to get the volume of that porta john and do a calculation and make a little closure around that area for 21 days. And it either has to be 21 days or after 7 days of closure, we can test for MSC. MSC isn't the perfect tool. MSC is supposed to be, it's supposed to indicate human, or the intent was that it was going to indicate human pollution, but it really doesn't. Any warm-blooded animal is going to have MSC in their waste. So we could get high MSC background because of waterfowl in the area. Like the Ponegantset Bay gets discharged from Buttonwood Brook in the zoo. So there are all kinds of different sources of MSC to the environment, but high MSC doesn't necessarily indicate risk of human pathogens. And so it's a difficult one. We could test fecals. That's something we do when we do contaminated relay, which is where we can take any shellfish, but typically it's cohogs. The Taunton River has areas that are classified as restricted, so the water quality is a little better than prohibited, and those products, those shellfish can be depurated. So they can either be depurated at a plant that has a depuration operation, or they can be depurated by transplanting them into waters that are in the open status. They're clean enough, and we have to keep them for 60 days, and then we test them again to make sure that the fecal levels are low, and then we can open them to harvest. So there are tests that you can do, but the thing is, depending on why you think you need to test them, those situations can be very episodic, right? So you could test them many, many times, and you're missing when the actual event is. So the question was, is the distance between farms and the distance the farms are from the source, does that make them close less? And that's absolutely true. So Seth, well, I guess technically he sold his operation, but he's still kind of running. He's still in the game, and he has a couple sites. He has one in Petitpas. That one tends to get shut down, but they typically use it as a nursery. It's not a high impact, but we need to get around 30 million gallons, the tens of millions of gallons of discharge before it really impacts way toward the Gosnold and the Cuttyhunk, the Elizabeth Islands. Buzzards Bay is pretty deep, and if you figure if we still need all that deep water to dilute the volume, then we must have gotten a really high discharge, a high volume discharge. But yeah, the further away you are, the more water there is between you and the point source to dilute it before it gets to a level where we have to close it down.
I will agree, though, that Seth is out there.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the question was, we've got 400 years of history of eating oysters here on the east coast of the United States. And has the mortality rate from consuming oysters changed as these regulations are becoming implemented? Is that?
Thank you for summarizing.
Okay. The initiation of regulations for managing oyster harvest started in about the late 1800s and the early 1900s because people were dying from eating oysters. So cholera, Vibrio, a whole host of diseases, typhoid, hepatitis. There was just a horrible, and it all started with the invention of the flush toilet. And so, yet I would say that we're not being over-regulated. I think that the regulations need to be refined a lot more, and we're certainly working on that. But at this point, again, if I make people sick, I'm going to not be able to sell oysters. So I would rather, as much as I hate the concept of the precautionary principle, I think under some circumstances, that certain level of it is appropriate.
Yeah, and I think in terms of some of the illnesses, like specifically Vibrio, where we have seen an uptick in illnesses, while we're seeing more illnesses, we're not seeing an increase in the rate. We've had our oyster industry explode, so we're seeing a few more illnesses because we have that many more oysters being consumed. So the number of illnesses per serving isn't increasing, and largely when we do these tracebacks, so the Department of Public Health gets the first indication that there's an illness, and this is Vibrio. This is an acute illness, right? Somebody gets sick, they have a gastrointestinal event, they went to the hospital. Now, the vast majority of people are just like, oh, I ate something bad, I'm gonna have a miserable couple days, but they don't go to the hospital, but some people do. And if they go to the hospital and it is clinically confirmed to be Vibrio, then we do tracebacks and try to figure out whether, it's growing area related or, post-harvest abuse. Dale did a good job of explaining how once Vibrios are in the shellfish, if we keep them cool, then it's just, whatever load they came out of the water with is pretty much where it's gonna stay. But if they are sitting on the dock at a 90-degree day, now we're doubling and tripling that load, and now we have an effective dose. But it's more, for these flows, it's not acute illnesses we're talking about. So it is difficult. We don't have a good understanding of what chronic exposure, maybe we care too much. But as Dale mentioned, the NSSP started, I believe it was typhoid, and there was an outbreak. And so it was due to these outbreaks. And that's where actually industry came together too, because they wanted some protections, because when there's an outbreak, all of a sudden nobody wants to eat oysters. And so it really does crush the market for a period of time. So this was actually a way to try to enhance the safety of the overall market. But you're right, people who have been eating oysters or soft shell clams from areas for generations that we're now closing down, what's changed? Well, the standards changed. That's what's changed. And it's a hard pill to swallow when I get it.
The question was whether the current government shutdown has impacted my business and my ability to sell oysters, and whether I foresee, if the shutdown extended, whether it will become more and more impactful. So far, the only real impact that we're seeing, and whether it's due to the shutdown or just the time of the year, the market has softened up quite a bit in the last month. It often softens up in the fall, for a whole host of reasons that I could get into, but won't. But oysters at this point is a white tablecloth, sort of high-end food item. And so if people don't have money to go to the restaurant to buy oysters, then we're not going to sell them because not very many people feel competent enough to work with oysters at home. So it's a definite maybe. Sorry, that's all I can do.
Our impact with the federal government shutdown has largely been with the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Dale mentioned that we have laboratories. We have one in Gloucester, we have one in New Bedford. I mentioned that MSC is the only tool, the only method we have to test them earlier, after 7 days, so we can get them open earlier than the 21-day closure. We just recently had our New Bedford lab do the method verification, and we submitted the report. And so there's a delay in getting that report evaluated so that we can get the certified isn't really the right terminology, but basically approved by the FDA to use the New Bedford lab to open them. Right now, we have to, Friday Dale's gonna take us out first thing in the morning, collect a sample, and then we need to drive it up to Gloucester. And so this delay in getting the federal government to approve it is impacting it. It also is our FDA shellfish specialists really are partners in management. We often request their guidance because if they're going to be evaluating our compliance, we want to find out if they think we're non-compliant by asking them, for some guidance in some situations. So it's become difficult when your colleagues, you really can't have communications with your colleagues, or it's severely limited. And it's also difficult because some of these colleagues are your friends, and it can be demoralizing to hear their stories. So while we haven't had a major impact in terms of our operations, we have had an impact. So the question was, do we have any data indicating that climate change, which is projected, climate change scientists are projecting that we're going to have more frequent and more severe rainfall events, and how that's going to impact these discharges and impacts to the farmers. And Dale, he was pointing out his little outline here. The speaker last week talked about climate change and the impacts, and we really are seeing additional frequency, but also not only are we seeing more rain events, we're seeing the rain events come down at we're seeing more rain in a smaller amount of time. So the severity of these events are increasing. And so we are in fact seeing that. We have some of Dale's CSO closures. There have been some times where we get the results in the morning to open, and then in the afternoon we have to close again because we had an event. And so we certainly are seeing the severity and frequency increase. Dale?
So another thing that we haven't talked about, but is directly impacted by climate change, and particularly the warming seawater, there are a number of diseases that oysters get. They're not transferable to any other organism, but they kill oysters. And the three primary diseases that we are fighting against are warm water organisms. And so as our water temperature starts to climb, we're going to see probably higher prevalence of these diseases. And they can be fairly severe. I've known some farms that have lost 90% of their crop within a 1 month interval with one of the diseases. So not just another risk that we have to deal with as an oyster farmer.
So the question was, we've been talking about raw oysters, but there are other shellfish that are cooked, and does that eliminate the problem? So when it comes to these pathogens, bacteria, viruses, yes, cooking will kill those pathogens if they're cooked well. It doesn't change the standard for the classification areas. In terms of the fecal coliform standard, if the coliform standards aren't met and we have to have designate an area as prohibited, even if the only product coming out of that area is destined to be cooked, we still can't, because even though the vast majority of them may be cooked, there are people who could eat them. Like, there's no market for ribbed mussels. I've never had a ribbed mussel, but by all accounts I've heard they're pretty gross. But there are some people who consume ribbed mussels. Yes, and so we're managing to that, lowest denominator, that if there's a chance somebody's going to eat it, then we have to close it down. But you're right, that if you cook the shellfish well, it will mitigate the microbial risk. Now, when we're talking about wastewater flows that could have pharmaceuticals, PFAS, cooking's not going to do anything for that. And also for harmful algal blooms, the biotoxins produced by harmful algal blooms, you can cook, you can freeze, that will not remove the toxin. So it really depends on what that human health threat is in terms of whether cooking will mitigate the threat.
If an oyster or any shellfish is harvested from an area that has been designated by the state as approved for harvest or conditionally approved in the open status, that animal is perfectly healthy to eat. Do not walk away from this thinking that every single oyster that you're going to run into is going to make you sick. The state does an excellent job of monitoring all of those areas. They are under very strict guidelines by FDA, as we've talked about repeatedly, and they are bound by the federal government to do that testing and to ensure that those classification areas are what they say they are. So, please eat more oysters.
And I just want one more plug here. In this entire talk, I think one gaping omission has been that the state's partners in managing shellfish are the local municipal shellfish constables. They are the boots on the ground, so thank your local shellfish constables if you love your shellfish.
What an informative evening. Thank you so much. Here's a small token of our appreciation. It's a Science Cafe mug. I'd just like to remind you that our December 2nd Science Cafe will feature Seth Letterman, the CEO of Tonix Pharmaceuticals, and he will speak about No Fairy Tale, the story behind a new FDA-approved fibromyalgia drug. So, see you then.